It is dawn, a thin glimmer of light on the hill opposite the 13th century building St. Eve's in which we reside and conduct our circles of life, our circles of the rose. Unfolding petals, we emerge from the darkness of unspeakable horrors and even greater potential. The lifting of a pandemic, we fervently pray that it is so. We recall you, Black Madonna, in this moment of terror and horror in our own country, over 500,000 people gone, suffocating in their own bodily juices. Out of this time, we hear the song of the doves calling and cooing softly, the swifts darting across the windows of the San Charles room. A wind lifts as the sun rises, fluffing the beautiful silk banners that mark our attendance and participation in this remembered rose of faith and dance. We face this rising sun, stand, pray in the dawn, and await the words that began our day, the word that is life, the word that is now. Let this threshold moment be realized for all the meaning of what the darkness has been. May we carry forth those lessons in an active way to renew life. Noah.
Thank you, Apila. Thank you, Ruth, for a very heartful and elevating invocation and music for our community call today. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome all of you to our monthly call for Chartres. Each year, going into our 16th year now, we are convening on a monthly basis to consecrate ourselves in the sacred energies of the divine feminine that is embedded so profoundly in the telluric energies in the sacred hill and cathedral of Chartres. Today is the Sunday before the equinox, and I want to welcome you in the spirit of springtime, in the spirit of the surging life and generativity and eros of the earth all around us. We can no doubt all feel her energy and her fertility as the flowers bloom and the blossoms appear on the trees and the sun begins to rise earlier and earlier in the mornings. So it's in that spirit that I want to welcome everybody to our call today. I would like now turn it over to Banafsheh Sayad, my good friend and co-director of the Chartres Academy, who will commence our program. Banafshe.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you. Greetings to everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Since dream work is such an integral part of the Chartres Academy, I'd like to share with you a very special and magical experience I've had that involves a dream. On March 8th, a very close friend of my sister's had a dream of her late mother-in-law, Giti. Her name is Giti, who was a writer and a poet and passed in September of 2020. Her name means the universe and cosmos. I knew Giti and saw her from time to time, and we admired each other very much. But she definitely spent much more time with my mother and my sister. So in this dream that my sister's friend recounts as very real, Giti appears in her room and tells her to go to her jewelry box and take a specific ring that she shows her and says to give this to Banafsheh Sayad. Now, this ring apparently was very dear to her, and she wore it during all major life events, apparently, especially during celebrations. And she was a very big celebrator through parties all the time. So my sister's friend says, she's surprised and says in the dream, "You mean Mariam Sayad, right? Mariam is the name of my sister." And Giti immediately shows her a beautiful doll of a flamenco dancer dressed in a bright red dress and says, "No, Banafsheh Sayad." So my sister's friend wakes up the next day and shares the dream with my sister and says, I'm going to give Banafsheh this ring and I'll give it to her on her birthday, which is in September, right? And my sister says, no, her birthday is in 2 days. So she sends the ring, she gives the ring to my sister to bring to me. On my birthday, we were having a small gathering with friends and family. And she sends the ring to me, and here it is. She wore it on her pinky, and it fits exactly on my pinky. It's a beautiful ring of gold and diamonds. And she sends along with the ring this card of a little red bird, and in it she recounts the dream and says that she chose this card because Giti reminds her of a red firebird. And in it she writes, "I pray that this ring brings you the blessings, light, prosperity, and magic that its original owner intended for you." Now, as I was dressing for the evening, I decided to wear a red sweater like this one, and I wore these earrings. You can see there are little red feathers. And I had not been wearing much jewelry since the pandemic began, and I certainly had not been wearing these. I might have worn them once or twice since I've had them. And they're very special to me, even though I haven't been wearing them much, because they're a gift from my beloved who gave them to me 2 years ago. And our relationship has gone through very difficult trials and tribulations since the pandemic began, and we're currently sorting out how to move forward. And I'm trying to understand the messages of this serendipitous gift from the beyond, from Giti, from the universe, and the synchronicities around the gift with the red bird and my love relationship. I'd love to hear what insights come to you, if you'd like to share them in the chat. But now I would like to turn the floor over to our honored guest, Brenda Crouter, who is here today with us. She's a Jungian analyst and a depth psychologist who lives in Eastern France. She has published many articles and at present is working on a book about the relationship of the soul of the earth to our dreams. She's a very popular and well-loved presenter at Ubiquity and is currently teaching a webinar on the I Ching, which is getting very rave reviews. So as we emerge from the dark of winter and welcome spring, as Jim was saying, getting ready for the spirit of spring to take over and the spirit of renewal, we've asked Brenda to share with us her views on the shadow side of relationships and how we can transform them into pathways of renewal, love, and healing. And Brenda, please share any thoughts you have on the dream and the synchronicity experience I shared. And I will turn it over to you.
Good evening, everyone. It is, as Binafshi said, different in all places of the world, and it's evening here with the days lengthening, and we're going to talk about the shadow. Now, the shadow is a very wide-branching subject and extremely important in the times that we live in. The whole world is actually undergoing what seems to me tumultuous changes. Now, Carl Jung did not have a negative nor a very personalized view of the shadow. And he felt that it was really everything that was unknown and mysterious to us. Though he recognized what we call the personal shadow. So let's start with that, for there's much light in the shadow, and it's really the wellspring of our human nature. And indeed, our genuine light. And unlike what people think, the darkness is really the source of our creativity. And as we know in spring, the flowers come up from darkness, from the black earth. So remember also that we don't see the glittering stars unless it's a really dark night. So we know that the light needs darkness. So the shadow has many scintillating lights within it. Now, if you've ever seen the nature film of David Attenborough, who filmed the fishes in the deepest, darkest part of the ocean, there he found fishes with light, spots of light, and shots of lightning came out of them. And yet they had no access to the sun. They made their own light. And that's what the shadow does. So let's look at various layers of the shadow, because they're all interrelated, but we need to just separate them out to understand them more. And so let's start with the personal shadow. The personal shadow concerns all the things that are in your existential life that you experience now. So it's not the shadow of your ancestors, your nation, your religion, even though it touches on that, but we'll come to that. So let's start with how the stuff actually gets into the shadow. And we'll take a really simple example. A young child has really bad table manners, licks its plate. We've got visitors and the mother says, don't do that. And the child gets a reprimand. If it's done nicely, all that happens is the child learns how to be a socially accepted person and to communicate on that level. But the instinctive quality goes into the shadow. The child just feels enough ashamed to not behave like that. So forever afterwards, this instinctive urge is suppressed in the unconscious, but it's suppressed consciously. So this actually starts the development of consciousness. And so it has a positive side. That is, the child begins to know the difference between one thing and the next. If the child is of a certain temperament, it will follow what the mother has said, and so has chosen the way of developing his social side. And there are all sorts of other innumerable little experiences that build up the personal shadow. Now, the true virtue of the personal shadow is that it gives you a personal human solidity, an authority, and much profound knowledge of others who share the same predicament. And by this action, not only do we build up a civilized way of communicating with others, but we find out how they're made. And in this, we have a greater human acceptance and a deeper compassion. If we only have the idealized light version of humanity, how can we have compassion? So it's not based on the good, compassion. However, the fiery instincts collect and burn beneath. And we say, well, what is to be done with them? What do we do with all this suppressed energy? Can they become light? So the easiest form of the shadow is the personal shadow, and we can integrate it. But what do we find there? It's not all suppressed things. Now, if you come from a family that's very practical and you have an artistic gift, what happens is that the family may say, oh, it's not practical to be an artist. Why don't you become an accountant? You can always earn money that way. You're sure of work. You can make a lot of money. What happens to the gift? It gets stuck in the shadow. And so we have something like a star in the night sky, gleaming like a diamond in the darkness of the unknown region of the shadow. So it needs to be made conscious, but it is already light. There doesn't need to be any transformation into light. The star needs bringing up out of the darkness and into light. And this is one context of the shadow. Now, the other context is what we call the collective shadow. And I'll tell you a story about this, which cuts out a lot of descriptions. When I lived in England, I had a German teacher who used to come once a week, and she was born about 1955, sometime after the Second World War. One day, I happened very unintentionally to land on the subject of the Holocaust, and she was German too. And I said, well, I hope you feel okay about my mentioning that. And she said, oh, it's fine. I wasn't even born then. And she was quite cheerful about it. And then she told me a story. Her class, when she was in her early teens, was taken on a day trip to see their history. It was not mentioned before they went what actual part of history they were going to look at. So they got on the bus, and like all young teenagers, they threw their sweets, they made their jokes, they laughed, they moved about. And then the coach stopped. They'd arrived. And they got out, and they saw that they were at Auschwitz. And they saw that big notice over the gate, Arbeit macht frei. Work makes you free. They entered the gates, and there was a sudden silence, and a seriousness descended on them as they looked around and discovered this horror. This had been kept from them until this time. On the way home on the bus, there was absolute silence, absolute seriousness, and not a word was said. After telling me this story, in a very cool and ordinary way, suddenly, woof, like Mount Etna, she erupted and she said, how could we have done this? And cried and cried. So what are we seeing there? This woman did nothing, wasn't born then, but she was carrying the collective shadow in her soul. So she'd absorbed it from the culture without knowing the words. This then is the collective shadow. So what is the resolution of such a shadow? This is a a toughie, but it can be done, and I've seen it done. It's a deep, deep spiritual work of redemption and brings a new light into the soul. And because it's not a personal light, but it's a collective light, it enters the souls of all the other Germans, because it's the collective unconscious that you're in. So this is the nation shadow. And I'm sure you will all know of even recent examples of a nation shadow. So it's a great moment. Now, it was Jung who spoke about this particular shadow of the German people. And here he spoke about the mythological shadow. And Jung reveals it to us by showing us a part of history. So by the 4th century AD, the Christian era began in Germany. Christianization began. They were all separate tribes, not yet unified. This was more or less completed by the 8th or 9th century. But it was under the Emperor Charlemagne. Now, previous to this, the whole of the Germanic region was pagan. And the human war god and the famous war god, Wotan, was a tremendous power. Now, the Christianity by Charlemagne was forced onto the people. They had a choice, take Christianity or die. So they saved their lives. Of course, people converted. But the pagan energy was pushed down and down and down into the psyche. And there it lay, along with the god of war, Wotan. Christianity was thus like a fine and brittle icing over the German psyche, which was still living in the main in the repressed pagan world. So just before the Second World War, the old pagan god, neglected and unsatisfied for centuries in the German psyche, erupted. It was therefore not integrated and understood and spread out like a collective psychosis within the German people. So their fiery, warlike god awoke after many centuries of unconscious repression, which was carried unconsciously in the shadow. Now, there are many records of passivity and strangely paralyzed psyches within the human being, within the Germans, during this time. And that is exactly how a collective psychosis looks. People cannot hear reason, but are utterly convinced, not by their own insight, but by an unconscious force. I have a book of dreams from that time, published after the war by a journalist who wrote many dreams down of that time in code so that the Nazis would not read them if her journal was found. Even in the most simple of people, the dreams were showing the common cataclysm, that something was about to erupt from the collective shadow of the German people. So now we can move to the world and we say, what does this worldwide pandemic mean? Can we see it in shadow terms? I think we can. I had this dream in February 2020, and it announces the arrival of the coronavirus. And this was perhaps a month before France went into confinement. I didn't know what it meant at the time at all. This was the dream. I'm in Switzerland, having an aperitif on the terrace with my student colleagues outside the study place in the mountains. It's a very beautiful sunny day. And suddenly I see an exquisite face floating amongst a group of people chatting. It's vaguely oriental and on the side like this, but it has a mask across its face made of white silk. It's vaguely oriental and disappears in a flash. Then I look to the right and see what looks like branches of trees, all floating down, but made of silver, full of light. And then suddenly I see a beautiful ball floating on the air currents, a bit like a dandelion seed head with spikes sticking out of it, made of silver and gleaming in the sunlight. As it drifts down to earth on a gentle breeze, I watch it closely. I see that no one else can see it. No one else seems to have noticed it. And there the dream ends. This was a really beautiful dream, and I felt that perhaps it was bringing a message, but not concerned with the world. Then later, I recognized the dandelion seed head, so called. It was a biological image of the coronavirus that we're now used to seeing. Hidden in the shadow of my psyche, which had touched the psyche of all the world, was the face with the mask and the coronavirus image. This was a premonition of the coming pandemic, but I didn't understand that at the time. So the shadow shows us many things, if only we can be alert to the light within the shadow. But what might it mean that the psyche thought it was so important that it should come in a dream? Now, if the virus is coming from Mother Nature, this is alerting us to the feminine aspect of the world, which has been so disrespected. Nature has been so abused, so destroyed in some parts, that nature cannot do anything but act with a virus or a fire or an earthquake, for the earth is a living being. So it's a timely reminder to us that light can come out of the shadow and that there is a spring within all of us. So we could say that the personal shadow, the family shadow, the nation shadow, the mythology of the shadow, and the shadow of the world all needs dealing with. We come full circle to our personal responsibility. For if we all do our personal work with the shadow, then this touches all the other work and we contribute to the world. In this way, everyone counts. Everyone's psyche is marvelous, even though we have to be realistic about some, but we do not know the tasks that human beings are given. So in a way, we have to use the shadow as a way of getting to the light, just as the flowers come up from the dark earth. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Brenda. Thank you very, very much for that. That was very, very deep and illuminating. And, you know, it reminds me that there were even crop circles in April and May around the coronavirus. And so the point that you're making is that there's individual shadow, there's family shadow, there's national, ethnic, racial shadow. And with the pandemic, we're seeing a global shadow in relationship to humanity's relationship to the larger ecosystem. And even the earth herself was manifesting images of the coronavirus at the moment when we were all succumbing to the virus. It's a very, very profound notion of just how large and extensive the shadow is. And I'm just wondering if you could comment on, the interactivity of the individual and the collective whole as we're going through this pandemic, because it's the first experience, at least that we know about, where everybody in the world has undergone exactly the same experience. So in a fundamental way, we're all collectively being immersed in shadow content right now, and through a little virus. And we think of this, the reason why I wanted you to comment on that is that we think of the shadow as something psychic, something that sort of happens to us in terms of our feelings or emotions or our psyche, our consciousness, as it were. And this was a manifestation of shadow physically through a small little virus. And I just love your comment on the physicality as well as the psycho-emotionality of shadow.
Yes, I mean, if you really think about it, the physical and the psychic fit together, and there probably isn't much difference. But sometimes, because we want to be individualistic, we want to separate ourselves from nature and to observe it. But if you really think about it, we are already individual little sparks, but we all belong together. So sometimes people say, but I'm just one person. What can I do? How do I work? Well, if you reverse that a little and say, well, I have inside me the cosmos. I am just a reflection of the cosmos. Therefore, the cosmos can work with me. So people often think that they're the ones who must think it. But if you're receptive, you will get the dream or the feeling coming to you. So you don't always have to be in action. Now, to be in action, to go outwards all the time, is an extroverted view. But to be in action the other way is to listen to the cosmos and get a reflection inside. So what we're going to have to do is find out truly who we are and find out the best way to work with the shadow, rather than to use the shadow as though it were an object out there. It isn't. Everything we don't know is in the shadow. And as Carl Jung once said, when he was very, very old, in an interview, which was broadcast on TV, he said, really, I only know so much. And he pointed to the tip of his little finger. He said, that's all I know. And he really meant it, because he knew that this huge shadow was really what we did not know. So now we have science contributing. We have the scientists saying about the virus and where it comes from. Then we have the introverts more or less saying, well, we have to change our spiritual life. This will affect the virus. And then the rationalists say, how can your spiritual life affect the virus? It's a physical thing. But if we're one and the same thing, psyche and matter, which is an image of wholeness, we can think differently. Does that answer your question?
Yes, well, thank you. And there's another question in the chat about how exactly do we use the shadow to gain the light?
You have to, first of all, begin with the personal shadow and look at your life and see what is hiding in there. Now, you won't get everything because you'll enter in the cosmic darkness. When you meditate, for instance, to put it in a simple way, because many people meditate and they think they're meditating, but how do you know you're not being meditated? And this was of course, was the dream that Jung had. He realized that when the image that he saw in the dream stopped meditating, that he would die.
Mm. Mm.
So,
You know, it's interesting. The YouTube that I saw, and I'll put in the chat in a moment or so, with the scientists who started to really examine the Earth circles about the COVID virus. He began to, as he really looked deeply into it, he realized that not only was the Earth telling us she knew that it was happening, but before any of the scientists were starting to really fix on what ultimately came into our vaccination regimes, the Earth, through the crop circles, was giving us the keys to the healing that we all needed. And I think that's a profound awareness that all of us need to carry, that in the depths of the shadow is actually the elixir for the redemption that we all seek. It's just a matter, as you're saying, of recognizing the shadow. And like the woman after visiting Auschwitz, allowing the shadow to surface that's been dormant for the whole time. And it's the surfacing that is actually the catalyst for the nurturing and the healing.
Yes, I would say that. So, yes, it's absolutely so. Because once one of the gifts that you have comes out of the shadow, suddenly you feel like a blossom tree. And it has an emotional effect. Or even deeper, it has an effect on the feelings, not just the emotions. And that is the most subtle effect of all, because the emotional reaction is a reaction, but the feeling is a quality of depth. So once it gets over the threshold of emotion and into feeling, you're looking at something absolutely wonderful. So you start with small things and not rationalize the shadow. It's important not to rationalize it, so it's something that's not yours. So you begin by saying, my shadow.
Oh, thank you. And here's a comment by Marcia Raff that she's saying, good morning. I have a dark shadow. She didn't say how to bring in the light. I'm going to have to speak to her. So I think Marcia's wanting you to say a few more words on how you bring the shadow into light.
You bring the light out of the shadow. The light is in the shadow like a star in the darkness. It's there. The shadow isn't dark. It's unknown. We have a conception of shadow as of darkness, but in the psychic realm, it means what is unknown. And is there a glittering star or a gift hiding in there? That means you have to experientially practice by looking into it in your everyday life. Say, for instance, you've gone to dinner and you see that you can't stop talking about a certain subject. And everyone begins to look a bit bored. And we've all met people like that. Now, if you're aware enough, you will realize that the shadow is coming up and people are reacting to it. And so it comes up through self-observation. So that means that there's something that's irritating people that you don't know about. And you have to go and look at it and see what it is. You have to do it experientially. There isn't a paradigm of how you can find it.
Yes, well, that's very profound, that the shadow isn't dark, it's just unknown.
Yeah, it is unknown, but it's conventionally seen as dark because, of course, it's
right.
The shadow is our dark side in a way, but in the dark there's light. And even in alchemy, you find what are called the scintillations, like those fish in the dark sea. They're giving off sparks and they're in the shadow. And you only see the sparks because it's dark. So they go together.
Mm.
You can't see the stars in the sunlight. There's no way you would find the star in the sunlight.
Yes, and Crystal Steinberg is making a point here. I'd love to have your comment on the Toltec notion of recapitulation. This practice among the ancient Mayans, which is also universally practiced in mystical traditions all over the world. Knowing that shadow is the unknown is to spend time every day recapitulating, deliberately, consciously seeking to remember and to understand and to delve back through the day into those actions, thoughts, and words that we weren't thinking about when we were saying or thinking or doing them, but in some way shaped our feelings and our psyches. And it's the very act of making that hiddenness conscious day by day by day in this spiritual practice of recapitulation that is a time-honored source of human renewal and healing.
I would agree that that's a very good way of searching for what is in the shadow that is light. Because you see the word, not capitulation, but recapitulation.
Yes.
It's a repeat, it's a circular form, which is a mandala, which is a symbol of the self. So by recapitulating, you are going over and over and round and round. And in that way, with repetition, up comes the truth. Repetition is very good.
Well, you know, and excuse me, go ahead.
A spiritual habit, if I could put it that way. I think Apella had a question. I thought I saw something come up.
You have a question, Apila?
Apila, sorry.
Yes, I did. I was wondering, when you mentioned Wotan or Odin, you only mentioned the dark side of the god, and I thought that was kind of interesting and apropos. So I just wondered if you'd comment on that.
Yes, it's a lovely question because it shows us what can be in the dark. At that moment in history, the dark side of Wotan came up. But of course, his other side is wisdom, intuition, and bringing things out of the dark. So you see that in this dark moment of the Second World War, what was in the shadow was the hidden wisdom of the event.
I had a chance, Brenda, to visit churches in England, in the north of England, and the doors were, the churches had always a door to the north, honoring the healing and the wisdom of Woden and the north wind. And when the church came through, or no, the church already was there, but when the older people of the tribes, Anglo-Saxon, died off, the churches bricked up the north entry.
Typical. Yes. 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 So they caused a blockage.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, the Anglo-Saxons, interestingly, when they invaded England, they cast the runes before to see if it was appropriate to invade England. Because the Anglo-Saxons came about the 5th century. And before that, of course, we were all Celtic speakers. English came 1,500 years ago. That's all. It's the newest language in the world. And the Anglo-Saxons brought that.
Mm.
So they consulted the runes and invaded us. And they brought their pagan Wotan with them. So no doubt that's why one door was blocked.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Cynthia Bledsoe has a good, I think, final question Brenda, and that is that in the shadow is our completeness, frozen and left behind. It is yours to nurture, but once you do it, it becomes part of you and all of us. It is not possible to integrate and heal our shadow without also helping to heal and complete all of us, so that the healing of one's personal shadow is connected with, and in fact, critical to, the healing of the collective shadow. That's a beautiful question, Cynthia. Thank you. Brenda, your comment?
I think it's wonderful. It's just how I would say. You start with the personal, and it affects the whole world. We all count. And this, of course, deepens the relationship we have with each other. Once we see the shadow in the other, and we know that we have one, whether it's a good or a bad, if you want to put it that way, our compassion comes alive. And this is the thing that opens up the world.
Beautiful. Well, Brenda, thank you so much. You've illumined the shadow in very profound ways. I think for me, particularly this notion, the shadow's not dark, it's simply unknown. Mm. And the act of consciously seeking to know in a way that breaks through the structures of culture and tradition and convention and allows the truth to emerge. And I think Apila's made a very profound point that Wotan had shadow content, but Wotan also was a powerful, dynamic motivator of creativity and dynamism in the culture, so that even the shadow has light and, shall we say, dark dimensions. The shadow isn't always just dark and therefore bad or evil. The shadow is a highly complex but repressed phenomenon in the psyche that when it surfaces, it also is multivalent, as Rick Tarnas would remind us is true of all the archetypal forms. Mm-hmm. And it's connected. I think the other profound point that you're making is the interconnectivity between self and family and community and tribe and globe and earth, all in an interconnected weaving of shadow and light dimensions. And every time we speak and think and do, we are bringing into constellation different combinations of that full spectrum life that animates us all.
Mm. Yes.
So beautiful.
We're in a beautiful web, and sometimes we don't know it. But we can contact it with work of the best kind.
Mm. Well, thank you. And we wanted to speak about this, everyone, because we're approaching the equinox and we're all feeling around us the surge of spring. And even though the pandemic has been with us since last equinox, it was a year ago last week, just to bring to everyone's collective recapitulation, that the World Health Organization identified COVID for the first time as a pandemic. So we've been living in a collective pandemic for exactly a calendar year, from equinox, spring equinox, to spring equinox. And so we wanted to bring this dynamic complexio to our collective attention. Now I'd like to ask Banafsheh to talk to us about the rose circles that she and Ruth and Peggy and Ann have been formulating for some time now. And on the 20th of March, the day of the equinox, we're going to have our first rose circle. Banafsheh?
Yes. Thank you for this very engaging discussion, conversation. We will be celebrating spring in our first rose circle, which will be this coming Saturday on spring equinox. The rose is as the primary symbol of the feminine archetype, the great goddess, and the soul represents love, creation, fertility, wisdom, beauty, and mystery. So we decided to gather and especially begin on the spring equinox to plant the seed of beauty, love, and harmony in the rose garden of our hearts. As Jim mentioned, I'll be joined by Anne Baring, Ruth Cunningham, and Peggy Rubin, and everyone is invited to join us and share your love of the rose. It's going to be a participatory event. We'll listen to a talk by Anne Baring, and Peggy Rubin will share poetry with us, and Ruth will be giving us amazing music, surrounding us with her beautiful voice and music playing, and I'll guide you into some movement. But the rest of the session will be sharing together our love of the rose. I'm going to put in the chat here the link to the, I'll add the link in a moment. But yeah, so this is what we will be doing, and everyone is invited. We'll be gathering on every equinox and solstice. We'll be having a rose circle.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. It's a wonderful addition to our Chartres Academy. I mean, if again, just to reflect back for a moment, we started with our liberal arts, and we're now in our third cycle of liberal arts, and then starting with Astronomica right as we were finishing the second cycle. We started Madonna Rising as another pillar of the Chartres Academy around the Feast of the Assumption, and those have now been building. So we have two pillars of our Chartres Academy, one which will be Dialectica this summer, the second liberal art, the second chakra, where we'll be really looking at the whole notion of relationships in a time of COVID. As you all know, the pandemic has really put the kibosh on all the ways that we have been traditionally and naturally greeting each other with kisses on both cheeks. If you're in France, the French haven't been able to do that for a while, and it's caused quite an amount of cultural and psycho-emotional consternation, hugging each other, even shaking hands. How many of us are so desperate for intimacy that we use our elbows to touch each other in the course of the pandemic? And we haven't been able to see even our family, our grandmothers, our grandchildren, the people in the neighborhood. And as the vaccinations are being rolled out and the pandemic is beginning to subside, but in some countries it's still becoming very acute. In Italy, it looks like they're headed into another lockdown because of surges. Other countries around the world, there have been surges. So what Brenda's been talking about today, everyone, is quite profound to take in, that we're in the grip of a global shadow experience, and how we embrace it, how we understand its multidimensionality, because as the crop circles were informing us, the shadow is also a healing vehicle, an instrument for our own redemption, if we would but relate to it in the kind of way that is therapeutic. And I think that's the major question before the human race now, is how do we, having been put in lockdown, having been forced into physical isolation for a year, where everything that we thought constituted our humanity has been turned upside down and shattered. How do we grapple with this shadow? How do we discern the messages that are emerging? Because I guarantee you, and I think Brenda and Jung and every analyst in the world would agree, if you don't grapple therapeutically and creatively with your shadow, it'll hit you again harder. And that's one of the lessons we took out of the Second World War, because the Germans in the world didn't grapple with their shadow. We ended up in a conflagration that in the end took 50 million lives, at the center of which was the Holocaust and the bombings of two Japanese cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so this is not an academic question. What we've been talking about today is deeply historical, deeply personal, and in fact critical. If in these next several years, when scientists are telling us we're literally running out of time to grapple with significant global challenges, we all have to rise to that occasion and embrace the shadow content that we ourselves have generated because we've disconnected from nature in the kind of way that can bring about human and ecological renewal. So I really want to thank you, Brenda, for a deep treatment of the shadow. And thank you all for being with us today. And I hope that you'll all join us for our Rose Circle. The rose is the center of Chartres, of Mary, the mother, Mary Magdalene. It's at the heart of mystical traditions the world over. And so we're bringing, between the two pillars of the Chartres Academy, we're bringing in a garden, a rose garden. And it's a beautiful, beautiful flourishing of our sanctum sanctorum for the Wisdom School and Ubiquity University. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Banafshe, for your leadership in bringing all this together. It's been beautiful. And Apila for your invocations time after time, month after month. Ruth, your music is so extraordinary. And now we're going to close our session with some music from Ruth, and then we'll have our final benediction from Apila, and then we'll see you on the 20th for our first Rose Circle. Thank you, everyone. Ruth?
Ave Regina Celorum, Ave Domino Angelorum, Salve radix sancta, ex communo lux est orta, Ave gloriosa, super omnes speciosa. Ave Regina, Ave Domina Angelorum,
The fragrance of the rose oil that anoints our gathering at Chartres, that opens the pathway to sensual remembrance and renewal. That fragrance, this circle, this virtual call, our love, stepping forward from this moment, from our computer screens into our own lives. May it be the threshold to the path of the rose, the light, the life of the way imbued with the power and passion of our commitment to do deep personal work, collective work, and so become one again in the garden. Mama Ua Noa.
Thank you, Apila. Thank you, Ruth. Thank you, Brenda. Thank you, Banafshe. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you on the 20th on the equinox for our first Rose Circle, and next month for our next community call. Blessings. Much love.
Bye, everyone.